After finishing 007 First Light, I did a strange test. I launched the game's intro one more time, and that's when I realized why this game works so well. For Bond, First Light may turn out to be what the Arkham series was for Batman and what Insomniac's game was for Spider-Man. The creators of Hitman made the most expensive game in Denmark's history because 007 First Light cost over 1 billion Danish kroner, which is more than $150 million. In this video, I want to share my impressions of the game, and let me point out that this is not a review. Let's begin.
What are you here for?
The newest James Bond game spent as many as 7 years in development. I was worried we'd get Hitman 2.0 with a few minor changes like giving the protagonist hair just so it could be sold as Bond. Thankfully, I was wrong. The developers went with the safest possible approach, probably asking themselves, how can we write this Bond game so that it feels as Bond as humanly possible? And that's exactly what they did. The game runs on IO Interactive Glacier engine, so certain elements like stealth, shooting and warp physics had already been thoroughly tested during the development of Hitman. What we got is a 15-hour-long campaign packed with action, and I divided that experience into several sections, each with a different level of player interaction. Don't worry, each subsequent section becomes progressively more important. The first type consists of cutscenes, where there's no player interaction whatsoever. 007 puts a much greater emphasis on James' journey from a rookie to the agent we know from the big screen, so naturally there are quite a lot of these pre-rendered cinematics. If this video is to be believed, they make up close to 1/3 of the entire game, which is dangerously close to giving a Path of Exile player a heart attack or causing information overload for a mixtape fan, you know, the supposed game of the year. But I think PlayStation exclusives have already gotten us used to that. In fact, they've even driven some players away because of it. Especially since, for example, giving the player a dialogue choice is often nothing more than the illusion of choice, because every option leads to the exactly same outcome. So those moments might as well have been cutscenes too, and the game wouldn't have lost anything because of it. I also couldn't leave out every moment involving any kind of vehicle control. IO Interactive found itself in a difficult position because car chases and fast cars are an inseparable part of Bond, while the Glacier engine, originally built for Hitman, wasn't designed to handle vehicles. So instead of exciting chases, we got heavily scripted sequences that, for the most part, could be completed simply by holding down a single button. Fortunately, unlike Mixtape, these moments are only a small addition to the overall gameplay. What bothered me more were the sections where we had to walk from point A to point B while listening to the exposition in dialogue, unable to interact with the world in any meaningful way, except that small hand gesture when you walk close to something. The biggest question worth asking is this: would James Bond's story lose anything if this game were transformed into 90% gameplay and only 10% cutscenes? In my opinion, absolutely, because some things simply can't be turned into gameplay. Then again, I'm also someone who enjoyed games like Spider-Man, Uncharted and The Last of Us, so it's pretty obvious I have my own preference. The second section consists of action-packed stages. These are the moments where there's no room for stealth. Everything around you explodes, blood is spilled, and so is vodka martini, shaken, not stirred. This is where you're supposed to feel like a fully trained secret agent and realize that the license to kill isn't meant to protect Bond, it's meant to protect everyone else from him. You're usually dropped into small combat arenas populated with a set number of enemies, while interactive environmental elements are strategically placed to make fights easier. That's important because you also have access to gadgets that can help eliminate enemies even faster. To prevent players from camping behind cover like in Gears of War, the game uses several different design tricks. First of all, your ammunition is very limited, forcing you either to make use of your gadgets or risk exposing yourself from behind a cover. Secondly, cover is often destructible, once again encouraging constant movement. And finally, your gadgets have limited charges, but thankfully refills are generously scattered throughout each location. As a result, on one hand you feel like you have to make thoughtful decisions, while on the other hand every weapon feels powerful because a single accurate shots to the unprotected head will always kill an enemy. These sequences usually play out at a fast pace and exist mainly to accelerate the action. On the downside, the enemy AI leaves something to be desired, as opponents often cheerfully walk straight into your line of fire. The moment that amused but also kinda disappointed me in the entire game was this scene. I honestly hoped that Greenway would keep handing me different weapons and ammunition forever. What a wasted opportunity. Here, Bond! Take my pistol, shoot at them. Here, Bond, take my magazine, shoot at them. Here, Bond, take my 42cm kurze Minekanone. Shoot at them. What's great is that all these gameplay segments blend naturally into one another, because in the third section you're dropped into an open map where your objective is simply to get from point A to point B while avoiding often armed enemies. IO Interactive gives you several ways to accomplish your objective. You can engage in open combat, or quietly eliminate enemies using the environment and your gadgets, or you can try to sneak through without being noticed at all. The bluff mechanic is especially useful here, allowing Bond to rely on his personal charm to lower an enemy's guard, even if only for a moment. The best part, however, is that unlike Hitman, Bond draws a very clear moral line. He doesn't kill people without a valid reason. That's why even if you're carrying AK-47, you won't actually be able to use it until an enemy points their weapon at you first. Only then do you earn license to kill, and only then you're free to unleash cheerful destruction. It's a bit like adding destructible cover to a shooter, so you can't simply pick enemies off like ducks. A tiny design change, yet one that completely changes the game's pacing and overall dynamics. The final section is probably the one everyone was waiting for. It's the moment when, as a secret agent, you're given the most freedom and have to infiltrate a new location. In its own way, it reminds me of Dishonored. The difference is that in Dishonored we usually operated from the shadows, whereas here we are thrown into public places and have to become invisible in plain sight, like a real spy standing right in front of dozens of people. And this is also where my biggest criticism of the game appears, because during your first playthrough, the ability to save the game manually is deliberately taken away from you. I understand the reasoning behind that decision. The developers want your first experience to feel like one continuous story rather than replaying every mission in every possible way. The downside, however, is that you only get one shot. Despite being somewhat flexible, the engine still doesn't give you a complete freedom, so it really would have been nice to be able to save the game manually, simply so you could experiment and tackle situations your own way without losing 15 minutes of progress. Toward the end of the game, I found myself choosing the safest and the most logical solution simply because I didn't want to replay entire missions. The funny thing is that I constantly came up with different ways of completing objectives, approaches that unfortunately weren't actually supported by the game. Here I have to admit that Hitman is superior when it comes to player freedom. I genuinely hope that in the next Bond game, IO Interactive gives players much more freedom in how they approach these open-ended missions, with at least 3 or 4 major solutions. And ideally, I'd love to see a true sandbox within each mission area where players could even complete objectives in ways that the developers never anticipated. But that's just wishful thinking on my part.
What does M stand for then?
You're very talkative, aren't you?
And all of this is wrapped inside First Light's story. After downing 07, typo. After finishing 007, I performed that simple test I mentioned earlier. I replayed the opening intro because I wanted to see whether it truly captured the feeling I had while playing through the game. And you know what? Not only does the opening music video perfectly capture the spirit of the game, but it also tells you a surprising amount about the story before you even know what's going to happen. Once you've finished Bond, I highly recommend watching that opening sequence again. Lana Del Rey did an incredible job with the song. It's one of the most Bond-like Bond songs I've ever heard. Did I mention this game feels incredibly Bond? I'll try to explain the story without spoilers, but IO Interactive did everything they possibly could to make you emotionally invested in this game. The first mission exists to introduce you to Bond, to help you understand what kind of person he is and what motivates him. The following chapters gradually build toward the first major plot point and the introduction of the first true antagonist. Right after Bond, I played The Wolf Among Us, and what amused me was that both games use a very similar storytelling device to emotionally hook the player. And and both of them pull it off exceptionally well, because they understand how to build an emotional connection with the player. The thing that disappoints me most is when I start yet another game and immediately get another "the whole world is in danger and you are the only one who can save it" scenario. The best games understand that people become attached through emotions, not through stakes or statistics. 007 spends its first several hours building exactly that emotional connection, and it works beautifully through roughly the first half of the story. But eventually the focus shifts, and that's where the problems begin. Because all of a sudden the story shifts from personal conflict to a global one. The game bends over backwards trying to tie those two storylines together. Some players will enjoy that transition, others will feel like the narrative loses its footing. And that's simply the price of making a Bond story where everything gets thrown into one big pot. The threat has to escalate until it endangers the entire world. If you combine that narrative direction with the fourth gameplay section I mentioned earlier, you end up with a game that can sometimes feel rushed. But the truth is, this may simply be an artistic choice. The closer you get to the climax, the less room there is for open-ended interaction, and the more you become a linear protagonist charging straight through the story. At first, I considered that a major drawback, but later I learned that IO Interactive plans to support Bond in much the same way they've supported the Hitman series, adding new missions and challenges over the coming years, while simultaneously working on the sequel. If that's the case, then the way the story unfolds starts to make a lot more sense, because the developers already know players will eventually receive far more than what's included in a base game. Still, if we're judging it purely as a standalone product, played from beginning to end after launch, First Light clearly shines brightest during its first half, while its final missions have you with rather mixed feelings. Bond is full of, well, Bond things. A story filled with intrigue, beautiful woman, espionage, creative gadgets, and most importantly, the feeling that you are the secret agent sent on a mission for Her Majesty. To hell with it, I want Patrick Gibson to become the next Bond, here I said it. This guy genuinely understands what this role is all about. He can be charming and convincing without coming across as arrogant, the way modern characters are so often written these days. And he manages to do all of that in between being an absolute badass.
MI6 would never.
I'm not MI6.
The female characters aren't written in the obnoxious way modern games have become infamous for either, where every woman has to be tough, bold, and permanently irritating. Instead, listening to Bond's playful banter with Moneypenny is genuinely enjoyable. Both Isola and Teresa has clearly defined personalities that make them memorable. They don't need to have the so-called balls to stand out. Their femininity is more than enough. I think First Light is an excellent game that will only grow in popularity over the coming years, especially since IO Interactive plans to continue supporting it before releasing the sequel. So far, the game has sold over 3 million copies. Yet the developers don't seem to be panicking, even though the game reportedly needed at least 3 million copies sold just to break even. The story it tells, Bond's undeniable charm, its captivating woman, and its stunning locations, those are First Light's greatest strengths. I'm really glad I got to experience this story, because it's one of those games that might seem fairly average at launch, but I have no doubt it will become true classic a few years down the line. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I'm really curious to hear what you think about this new interpretation of Bond. Do you think he should stick around for long haul? As always, comments are yours and the likes are mine, so leave one under this video and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care, bye bye.